Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Joe Friel is a coaching legend in endurance sport. You've already heard from him in our mini series on the aging athlete, where we talked about how being consistent in your training is really one of the most important elements for any athlete at any level of the sport, including the ones that are aging up in their race category. But his lessons don't just apply to masters and grandmasters. In fact, his book, The Cyclist Training Bible, has been a go-to resource for many cyclists and coaches over the past 20 years. His latest and fifth edition keeps training principles that stand the test of time and have been updated for the latest tech and individualized training approaches. So today I'm back with Coach Friel to discuss key themes from his book that any time crunched or time rich athlete can apply to their training program for better success in health, fitness, and performance. Joe Friel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Adam. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, no, this is fun. Picking the brain of the coach of coaches is always super fun to do. So, first question is, why did you decide to write the fifth edition after so many years had passed from the advent of the first one?
Well, when I wrote the first, about 1996, the first edition of the book, and I got around to the late 2018, 2019, 2020 era, and I began to realize that, man, lots of things have changed. I just can't go back and edit. I really need to rewrite this book. So I just threw out the manuscript. The only thing I kept the same was the table of contents. And I just started writing a whole new book because there'd just been so many changes that had occurred in over, gosh, a 20-year period of time that I couldn't really live with myself. I didn't go back and make those changes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the sport has evolved at a great level, and but like I said, I think the the things that you write about, right, the evergreen kind of coaching things that will be here with us forever. I mean, we'll talk about some of those today. In a lot of this, it can go back to the basics, but the advent of the individualized like training process too, we'll press into that today. But where I'd like to start is with mindset. So if we can first talk about really, I think how you open up in the book is adopting a high performance mindset. Why do you start the book like that? And what is a high performance mindset for an athlete?
Yeah, good question. I always thought that the mental side of the sport was just as important as the physical side. And so when I've coached athletes over the years, I've spent a great deal of time trying to understand who they think they are as athletes and people. And if there's anything there that's holding them back from performing at a high level. And you always find these things. I've coached athletes from novices to Olympian, and it's always the same thing. They've got little things going on within their minds that are potential potholes, things that are going to cause us to stop. And so I've always tried to figure out what these things are and then try to not really quell them, but try to understand them as much as I can to help so I can better understand the athlete and how to work with this particular athlete. And so I started the book with that chapter because that for me is among the to look for when I'm talking to an athlete about coaching them. So, I started down the list of things that I look for, and these things are always evolving in my head. These things are not like carved in stone and never change. I'm always thinking about what sort of things am I learning that could apply to the athletes I've coached. And so I've come up with a list that is still used to this day when I talk with athletes about performance. So it's just a very important topic, one that cannot be ignored. If you ignore this, you're in huge difficulty with that athlete come down the road someplace.
Yeah, and I encourage everyone to pick up the book and learn a little bit more. We're not going to go over the 1, 2, 3s here on this podcast, but we're going to plant the seeds of kind of what to pull out from the book. But I think in the way of this mindset, like starting there, one thing that you wrote was attitude first, results then come next. Like, couldn't agree more. So if some listeners are here and they're like, what would be like the number? I can't get that like killer attitude. What's one thing that they can do kind of in their life or in their habits to start cultivating that performance mindset?
Yeah, there are lots of subset points here. I think first, and the one I always look for in athletes is motivation. That's key. If the athlete is not motivated to train, there's nothing I can do to make that change. I'm writing another book right now, and inside the book, I write about one of the athletes I coached who had poor motivation. Tremendous athlete, tremendous talent, but he had poor motivation, and that I could put up with that for only 1 year. If for example, if there's anything that came up whatsoever during the day that might interfere with his training that day, he would simply bow to whatever the thing was and not work out. But when it came to race day, he was a tremendous athlete. He was really one of the best race day athletes I've ever coached. He's just tremendous talent. He was a former national champion, junior national champion in road cycling. He had way too much talent, but it always came back to haunt him. Where it really hurt him the most was in the base period when we were trying to build a big aerobic base. That was very low motivation for him. And so those were days he would miss a lot of those days. And always just, for me, it was really a challenge to try to get him to train. And so that always showed up when we got to long races later in the season. We got to 3, 4, 5 hour races, and he had a hard time struggling to get to the finish line. His talent didn't mean anything at that point. He just didn't have the base he needed because he hadn't been motivated enough during the base period to establish that. So I coached him for one season. I just thought, man, I can't do this again. So I sent him on his way by himself. Usually if I let an athlete go, usually I'll refer them to another coach. Here's somebody I think could really help you. But this time I didn't do that because I just saw it as me passing my problem on to another coach who doesn't need more problems. So I didn't make any suggestions whatsoever for him. And he raced for a while after that on his own, as near as I could tell. I don't think he had a coach, and didn't really last very long, and eventually dropped out and was no longer racing, which was a shame because he was just a tremendously talented athlete that could have gone a very long way if he really put his mind to it. So that's the key thing for me, is I want to look for motivation in the athlete. There's lots of things that go into that, for the average athlete. I think one thing that really helps is to have a training partner. If your motivation is low, having a training partner really kind of gets you out the door. Another thing that might help you, it didn't help me with this one athlete, but one thing that might help you with low motivation is having a coach. If you feel responsible to somebody you're going to report to about how the workout went, that's your coach. And the coach is going to be looking dead. And sometimes that's a really good way to get motivated, is to hire a coach to work with you. And there are lots of other ways. I think, for example, everybody should have a second passion besides sport. I don't know what it would be. Whatever you're interested in besides sport, could be woodworking or playing the flute. I don't know what it could be, but whatever turns you on, that's a good thing to have. Having something besides training in your sport can give you something to kind of lean back on when those days when you're not really feeling really good about yourself because your motivation is low and you don't really feel like going for a workout. Just knowing you've got something there you can lean against that makes you happy kind of relieves some of the tension and allows you to make some decisions that might be a little bit better down the road in the future. There are lots of stuff. We could talk about motivation for an hour all by itself, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, those are really good things. And I think the thing that pops out to me is just limiting distractions as well. I think, when you talk about training coming to the forefront, and one of the things that we talked about in the previous podcast was focus on family, career, training. I think the little side hobbies are super important to remain balanced, but we're not talking about huge undertakings, and we're also not talking about diluting the focus. It's really keeping it tight. And rather than adding something in to stoke motivation, I would encourage people to look at distractions, look at things that take away from their focus and their energy, because you could have enough motivation, you could just have it depleted by all these other things.
Yeah. Yeah. Good points. It's extremely important to be motivated, but it's the sort of thing that you just can't turn on or turn off. It's something that needs to be there, to be able to take advantage of it, to be the best athlete you possibly can be.
Yeah, for sure. So as we turn to another key concept in your book, it's the individualization of training and recovery. When you wrote this, the first book or the first edition back in '96, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the concept of individualized training approach was a thing. Is that true?
That's pretty much the case. Yeah, we've all
Yeah.
tended the same way back in those days, and we've learned an awful lot over the years. Um, but the principle of individualization has been around for a long time, but not taken very seriously until maybe, I don't know, the last 10 years or so,
Mhm.
to become a much more serious topic among athletes and coaches about knowing what's unique about you. Everything is unique in some ways. They can't all train exactly the same way. We need to train in ways that are appropriate for us and whatever that means. And this really is a difficult topic to deal with. Um, and where I see most athletes making the big mistake in this area is they tend to look to others to see how they should train. So if they've got some people they ride with, for example, in a group ride, and somebody impresses them, they tend to gravitate toward whatever that person does in their training. They do it also, but you really can't count on that. What works for one person is not likely to work for somebody else. I know lots of people who just had lots of talent, like the person I mentioned just a little while ago, and it was natural talent. He just had everything going for him. He inherited the right genes. He was in the right place at the right time when they were handing out genetics for sports, and he came across because of that. He came across as being extremely talented, not so much in motivation, but in terms of his physical ability. He really had everything it took. If you use that guy as a model, there's lots of problems there with how he trains that may not work for you. He just was able to do things that I've not seen other athletes be able to do. For example, his bike handling skills were amazing. He reminds me of some of the pros you see from time to time who've got tremendous talent, tremendous skills. He had those skills. He could do things with his bike that most people can't do. So anyway, that's the sort of thing you want to look for in yourself. Is what makes me unique? Who am I? Don't copy others' methods. Find out what works for you. That's a very difficult thing to do, but one of the ways to do that is to look back when you've had your most success. When you had success, what were you doing that was unique at that time? What were you doing in training that really worked out for you? And then use that as kind of a model for how maybe you should look at your training going forward, not just doing things because you see others doing it. That's perhaps one of the worst things you can possibly do. So, and finally, I think you need to know your strengths and weaknesses. What am I good at and what am I not so good at? And knowing those things is going to go a long ways in terms of making decisions about your training. For example, I always have suggested that athletes should really focus on their weaknesses, which I call limiters. A race-specific weakness is a limiter. For example, if a race an athlete's going to do involves a lot of climbing and the athlete's not a good climber, that's a limiter. But if there's no climbing at all and the race is flat, then it's not a limiter anymore. It's a weakness, but not a limiter. So the idea is know what you're good at, know what your limiters are, focus on improving your limiters while you maintain your strengths. So that's really the starting place is who am I as an athlete? What am I good at and what am I not good at? And making that decision will help you make decisions in the future for all your training going forward.
Yeah. I think, I mean, the individualization of training is something that I preach and harp about on this podcast quite often. And in my brain right now, what I'm envisioning is this slide from Dr. Andy Coggan, and Tim Cusick uses it in a lot of his presentations where we show how people can make their power or make their pace. And effectively, it's the more aerobic we get, the more similar and predictable we are. The more anaerobic we are, that we do, or the harder effort, we are either much more anaerobic or not anaerobic at all. And so finding like your fingerprint or the phenotype of an athlete is also really important. And you talk about some field testing, some other things and tools that people can use in your book to help identify some of these individuality aspects to help them train and recover more. Not on the recovery side. I mean, we could talk about the podcasts about this too, but not everybody recovers the same. Like some people need the couch and TV. Some people need a book and quiet time. But decreasing stress is always the key. You just need to find what works for you in that way.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Somebody mentioned on Twitter, I read a note about that one guy was talking about some people recharge their batteries by being around other people. They're
Right.
extroverts, and some people challenge you recharge their batteries by being alone. Both are okay. There's nothing wrong with one or the other. It's just the way we are. We're human beings, and everybody's got their own way of responding. So do what works best for you.
Yeah, and as you can tell from my two examples, you can probably guess what vert I am on that. um, but to this point, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, for the self-coached athlete, what should they do about their individualized training? But the answer that I almost want to throw out there, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like don't be afraid to fail. Like go try, fail, and you'll figure it out. And you talk about that in your book, but I mean, there's a lot of trial and error, but you can point people in the right direction, right, Coach?
That's how we became adults from children, as we learn by failure.
Yep.
When a toddler is learning to walk, they fall down an awful lot, but they always get back up and keep on trying. Eventually, they learn to walk. It's the same thing with adults. We make mistakes. We're not perfect. And when we fall down, we need to get back up again and keep going ahead, because if we keep doing it, it's going to work out eventually. So it's really a mindset thing again. It's this idea that if I just stay focused on what my goal I'm trying to accomplish and stay at it, I can probably come an awful long ways towards accomplishing it. I might even pull it off in a short period of time. Or on the other side of the coin, it may take me a long time. It may take me a couple of years to pull this off, as opposed to a couple of months. But that's okay. That's because that's who you are as an individual. Don't take that to mean anything in the negative. It's just who you are, and you need to learn to live with who you are going forward with your training. Your training needs to reflect you as the individual. All the stuff ties together into one big bow, and we need to kind of keep all that in mind as we're making decisions about how we should be doing our workouts.
Yeah, and speaking of workouts, it's I want to change now to some adaptation and finding some peak fitness, because I think in the way of that individualized training, trial and error, there's these heavy time periods where we go through when we're building fitness, we're getting super fit, but along with that comes fatigue. We get tired. And I get questions on the podcast of, how much is too much, or, when should I punch through? And really it's the question of overreaching versus overtraining. Overtraining is a whole kettle of fish that we don't need to get into right now. Because again, that's probably 5 podcasts alone there. But overreaching is a very critical piece of the athlete's journey. So to you, Coach Friel, can you talk about what is overreaching, and when are athletes going to experience that overreaching effect of like where they're just tired and they need to kind of keep on going for a bit before we get the fruits of the training?
Yeah, this whole issue of fatigue and recovery from fatigue that's extremely important concept in training. In fact, I would say it's one of the key concepts when in laying out a program is how often should the athlete recover, because they're going to wind up overreaching. That's normal. Overreaching is considered to be something we really should find to be happening rather regularly in our training. We kind of push ourselves a little bit to the limit. We don't. When I say that with a little bit of hesitation, because when I say push yourself a little bit to your limit, most athletes think that means they got to push themselves so they can't hardly get off the bike anymore. They're just completely worn out. And that's not the way it is. Pushing yourself to your limit, I mean, just barely beyond where you are right now as far as your fitness. If you're able to ride 2 hours pretty easily in zone 2, for example, let's see if we can bump that up to 2 hours and 15 minutes as opposed to going to 3 hours or 4 hours to see if we can do it. We kind of like learn to hold back on this whole idea so that we have overreaching in very small quantities. We're not trying to We're not trying to whip ourselves into shape. We're trying to help ourselves come into condition, into fitness in a very gentle way, if we can. Give you an example of that. I coached an athlete a few years ago. Actually, he started doing something before I coached him. He came to me with a problem. The problem was he was very tired. In fact, he was so tired he could hardly get out of bed in the morning. And he brought his training log with him so I could look and see what he'd been doing. And what he told me he had tried to do was to create a training plan that was 8 weeks of nonstop high intensity. If he could get through that, he would start the season being in the best shape he'd ever been in. He could whip anybody at that point. He did just the opposite. He really just didn't have any enthusiasm at all for the sport, although he still wanted to continue training. He did in the 7th week of that 8-week plan when he came to me and wanted to know what he should do. And basically I said, well, you got to take time off. There's nothing, no other alternative here. You got to stop training. We got to get you back to normal again. And it all happened just because he simply did not take rest days. He just poo-pooed that whole idea of taking a break. He wanted to push himself to the limit as much as he could every day. And by doing that, he thought he could make himself into the superhuman, and had just the opposite effect. We all have kind of that notion in the back of our minds that if I just push myself a little bit harder, I can be a better performer. I can race faster. I can do whatever it is I can do better, push myself beyond my limits frequently, almost daily, as this guy thought. And that's not the way it works. The way it works is you work out in very small quantities. You take small bites moving forward for improving fitness. Extremely small bites. They're not big bites at all. You don't go 7 weeks of never taking a rest week. What you do, in fact, what the athlete should be doing is ask themselves, when should I take a break? Am I ready to take a break now? That's the key question. Am I so tired right now that I need to take a rest break, take off for 4 or 5 days, just really cut back on training, cut out intensity, cut back on duration, and just rest, take an extra day off and just rest? Should I do that or not? That's a good thing to be asking yourself. But athletes never ask themselves that question. They assume if they do that, they're a wimp, and they just aren't doing what they should be doing. The best athletes don't do that. The best athletes always push themselves to their limits every day is how they see the world, but that's not the way it happens. You won't see Tadej Pogačar on his bike pushed himself to his limit every day for 7 weeks. It's just not going to happen. But yet somehow we've come to the conclusion that's why these people are as good as they are, because they can handle this massive amount of training without ever taking a break. Not the case. They take lots of breaks. In fact, as the research has been showing from Dr. Seiler, Stephen Seiler, for the last 20 years, these athletes do about 80% of their training very easy. In fact, Tadej Pogačar's coach is a friend of mine, and Inigo says that that Tadej spends an awful lot of time, a gigantic amount of time, just riding easy. In fact, this is kind of like Inigo's therapy for everything is to ride in zone 2. Get a lot of zone 2 riding in. Everybody hears about that anymore. But that's who it came from, is Inigo San Milan, who coaches Tadej Pogačar and Juan Ayuso and a few of the other UAE guys. And they're doing pretty well. And they're not pushing themselves to the limits every day. They're taking it very easy most days, in fact. Very, very easy. They're training a lot in zone 2, which is not hard. I can train in zone 2. But it's amazing what it does when you take that attitude that I'm going to train easy, and by training easier, I'm going to become faster. And that really does happen. Why? It happens because, number one, you go into hard workouts feeling fresh, rested, and ready to go. So now you can really push yourself to your limit. It's hard to do that more than twice a week. An athlete who tries to get in 3 hard workouts in a week means you're only getting about 1 day of recovery between 2 of the hard workouts. And that's generally going to be not enough for the athlete to be recovered to really have a good workout 48 hours later. So what I emphasize to athletes is they work on what I call the 5-2 pattern. They do 5 days a week easy and 2 days hard. If they do that, I can guarantee them they'll come into the hard workout days and they'll become really hard workouts. The quality will be very good. So the problem is not so much physical, it's mental when you work with athletes on this question. We're kind of going back to the mindset thing again. If the athlete has to get out of their mind that the only way to improve is to push yourself as hard as you possibly can every chance you get. That is 100% wrong. It's just backwards from what you should be doing. It should be the other way around, where you push yourself very seldom during the week, like I suggested, 2 times a week. And if you do that, then performance is going to grow over time, and you're going to have much better performance than you've had in the past because of your ability to do things that most of the other athletes don't do. So I'll stop talking now because that's one of my favorite topics, and so I'll just back off of it.